Yes. To provide some context. So first of all, and not every single one of you needs to answer every question. But first of all, can you talk just a little bit about how the Combat Exclusion Law that was repealed in 1991, how did that impact your career or just simply operations within your squadron? So, yeah,
It totally prevented me from flying any.
Oh, do we not have, there's microphones. Yeah, there we go.
Yes, I flew A4 Skyhawks in the Navy, and it precluded me from flying any fleet deploying jet aircraft in the U.S. Navy. So I was relegated to a composite squadron or shore-based training squadron.
I was in the top 10% of my graduating class, but even though I put F-15s on the top of the list for my dream sheet, I got my second choice, which was a C-141. Not a bad aircraft, an excellent aircraft, but my second choice nonetheless. When I was at Travis Air Force Base in 1983 and I checked into the unit, within a couple of months of that, grenade operation kicked in. And there were some women like Margie here who were in units for the airlift of pulling the medical students out of Grenada. Another individual is somebody who was in my 141 unit, which was Eileen Collins. And so she went with a crew as well. And initially they were allowed to fly into Grenada, but once it was realized, hey, wait a minute, this is a combat environment, we don't want women there. So they stopped those flight crews from going into Grenada. I was 2 months in my unit and I saw firsthand, wait a second. You know, we're second-class citizens, we're fully qualified to fly the airplane you're tasking us to fly, but you're holding us back? It didn't make sense to me. When I flew C-21s, I flew general officers around a lot and also congresspersons. And on occasion, I would have a conversation with a general and say, so and this was the Air Force, not the Navy, because the Navy already had women commanding units, operational flying units, like Rosemary did very early on. But the Air Force didn't have that. And so I asked the general officers, are you going to see that in the Air Force? And they said, number one guy said, number one, no, because you don't have a wife. And the wife is part of the promotion process in the networking. And number two, it's because women can't fly fighters or high performance jet aircraft. And so those were some of the realities that I saw in my career.
Prior to the repeal of the Combat Exclusion Law, I was a KC-135 pilot and still was after the fact. However, when the time came for us to set up for the deployment, I would say that from the time that I was assigned to my unit, which was Grissom Air Force Base, what I got was a lot of questions, interestingly enough, from the wives saying, what happens if things go south and you have to go to war? You're not going to go, and my husband's going to have to take your place. In the tanker community, we flew what they called fixed crews, which meant you flew with the same people all the time, every time, which was great, to be honest with you, because you know what to expect from them, and they know what to expect from you. It's very important. So it was fascinating to me as we came toward our deployment to Desert Shield and Desert Storm. When I was at that time the chief of aircrew training and also all the scheduling. All the crews were certified to the war order. We basically, for 2 months prior, had been preparing for the deployment. 2 days prior to the deployment, we went in and aligned all the crews. We got everybody aligned, and as you know, if you've gone on a deployment, you have your processing, everybody, ground crews, everybody was getting ready to process. My senior NCO came in after the meeting and said to me, you need to know that the DO came in after you and said, take every woman off the cruise. So I said, I appreciate that. Thank you very much. Got up, went down the hall to his office, said, I need to talk to you about this. And he said, women can't fly combat. You're not allowed to fly in combat zones. We're taking all the women off the cruise. And I said, that is not how that reads, because you have certified us to the order. You've sat there again and again and said that we are, quote, not combat, we are combat support. You can be shot at, but you cannot shoot back. And he said, no, I stand by this. I said, fine. You think about that. And then if we can't come to a concurrence, I'm going to take it up with the IG and we'll do that this afternoon. We had a big staff get together for the deployment of all the commanders, etc. And at that point, the DO said, I want no one, not a single woman to deploy, ground crew, flight crew, otherwise. And after that, he and I had another very heartfelt conversation. At the end of it, the women ended up going. I was one of the first to deploy. And it was interesting because I was reassigned during my deployment. And my submitted meritorious service medal was downgraded. And and I have no idea what it was.
Rosemary was in the first group of women to begin flight training in August of 1972. Admiral Elmo Zumwalt issued ZGRAM 116, which was to open up opportunity for women in the Navy. And in the fall, they decided that they would open up aviation, since that was a warfare specialty that they believed Admiral Zumwalt knew that women could do, because he was a World War II veteran and he was familiar with the WAS. Rosemary was one of 4 women who went through Women Officers School. She was a civilian when the announcement was made, and her mom sent her a clip from the San Diego Union. She was at Purdue University and trained to be a professional pilot, trained to work for American Airlines, is what she was hoping to do. Although the vice president of American Airlines told her the world will never accept women as pilots in the commercial airplane. So Rosemary took the opportunity that the Navy had, and 4 women were on active duty, and they went immediately after they got their orders in March of 73. They started flying in Pensacola, and in May, Rosemary and her 3 classmates joined the first one. Along the way, 2 of the women dropped out, one because her husband didn't want to fly, and the other one had some problems, not flying problems, but other problems. And so she dropped out. So 6 women got their wings. And during flight training, they began to initially run right into the Combat Exclusion Law, even though they weren't in combat and getting ready to go on training missions. They were denied the opportunity to go out on an aircraft carrier. Rosemary was a little bit behind the other group, so the first 4 women ran into that, and soon became the first 3 women. Barbara Rainey and was the first, and Judy Newfer and Jane O'Day. And so they immediately were told, you can't go to the ship. Rosemary at about the same time finished at the top of her class. I qualified for jets with something like a 315, 316 average, a very high average at that time. Rosemary had a 323 when she went through. And so her first look at discrimination was, no, you can't go fly jets like Terry. She was the top of the class, in fact, had the top grades for that year, and she wasn't able to go jets because they interpreted the law that you'd have to go jets, you'd have to fly on an aircraft carrier. Fly on an aircraft carrier, it's a war ship. But of course, the training carrier, the USS Lexington, based in Pensacola, was not a warship anymore. It was designated an AVT, an auxiliary ship for a fixed wing training. Also did helicopter. So those 2 episodes happened about the same time. The women denied carrier qualification and Rosemary not getting jets, and they immediately started writing letters. And they learned very early that letters got lost real quick in the system. So they learned the process of writing letters with an advanced copy to somebody further up the chain of command. In this case, most of the time it was Oppo 5, the head of naval aviation. And they encountered some really good help. One of the guys in the bureau, Commander Chuck McGrail, was a crusty old, as Rosemary would describe him, crusty old fighter pilot in Vietnam, and he believed that it's better to ask forgiveness than permission. And he knew that as chief of naval operations wanted to give women expanded opportunities, so he wrote people orders. So he sent Rosemary to a squadron that had jets in it, even though she was trained as a prop pilot, flying twin engine S3s, excuse me, S2s at the time. And so Rosemary immediately started jumping in the back seat. She had a black A6 pilot, one of the few black pilots in the Navy, and one of the very few Vietnam veteran A6 pilots, combat veteran. And Ray Lambert taught Rosemary immediately how to mentor and to network, because as a black pilot, he had to talk to his contemporaries to stay out of trouble. And because there was still a lot of racism at the time in the Navy, and he explained to Rosemary, you're going to have many of the similar problems that I did. So Ray Lambert and Chuck McGrail and Elmo Zumwalt were the three people that facilitated the opportunity that the women had, although they had to beat their head against lots of doors to get that opportunity.
Thank you, Dan.
Well, as you know or you don't know, Army didn't have a law. It said we couldn't go to combat. It was policy. So as a test pilot, we could get trained into a combat aircraft, but I'd say who wanted to. You get much more flight time doing other things. The Army also in '77 changed the training for women, and rather than, so that in 1977, every female that went through basic training or officer's basic training went to the firing range. And it was expected of you, if you're shot at, by golly, you better shoot back. But let me talk about, I'll springboard off of something that Tommy said. Back in flight school, when I got there, I'm 5'4". And a friend of mine came in a couple weeks later, or about a month later, and she was 5'3½". She'd passed her flight physical. And she came, we were out having a drink, and all of a sudden she came up and says, "Hey, I'm getting kicked out, I have to go home." I says, "Oh, why?" She says, "I'm only 5'3½". I says, "So," well, and she had a waiver to fly. And they started kicking out all women who were below 5'4". And I says, "Well, that's not right." And she said, and in fact, the warrant officers in my class, there's a guy who's not even as tall as I am, and he gets to stay. Oh, yeah, what you said, shit. So what did we do? So this is, ladies, where you have to decide when it is that you're going to fight. And I like to look at, you have to pick your fight. And I like to look across, is what's happening, a standardization across the board. Will it affect our mission? So I grabbed my friend and a few others, and we went over to the warrant officers' mess hall. And if you don't know what the warrant officers have to do in the military or the Army, it's excruciatingly painful. And they have to, they go eat, but they have to walk upstairs in parade dress and stand there before they can get in the hallway. And so I stood there looking at all these guys coming up the steps. And if they were my height, we wrote down, or a little below, we wrote down their names. If they were higher, of course, we didn't. We had 56 or 57 names by the time lunch was over. We went to the commander, company commander, we went to the battalion commander, we went to the brigade commander. And we said, you have to throw these guys out if you kick these women in. And they said, oh, we can't do that. And we said, of course you can. So my friend got kicked out, so did 5 or 6 other women. They got back in a year later, only after we said we're not going to take no. We started writing letters. I didn't know enough to go to Congress, But we started getting people who had won little short men who'd been in Vietnam that had won air medals. And we got them to start writing Secretary of the Army, Secretary of Defense. So ladies, if you want to change things, because that's part of what this panel is, not only what we did, but why did we do it? You set up a network because you never ever want to go by yourself.
Let me add, say one thing on that, when we were, looking at the opportunities that people had, Rosemary was able to fly in the Navy in, A4s at first, when she transitioned in 75, because squadron had openings. And, however, the Navy did not really care too much about which airplane you flew. So Rosemary was able, thanks to Commander McGrail and the Bureau, gave her the opportunity to transition to A7s and go out to the Naval Weapons Center and fly test aircraft out there, testing weapons. So she was flying A7s and right after that, T-38s, F-86s as a drone pilot, getting full scale targets. And the Navy didn't care about what type of airplane you flew. They just cared about the mission and whether it was going off aircraft carriers. So the women, in particular, Joellen Osmond, who was the first helicopter pilot in the Navy, Joellen was restricted from going out to a ship to deliver cargo, which was what she was doing all the time, and everybody in her squadron did. But the chief of the Naval Air Forces Pacific would not allow a woman to fly over his ships in his ocean. So Joellen joined a lawsuit, and they sued for the right to expand that, and eventually the Navy changed that policy. But it took getting AirPac change of command in about 2 years before that happened. And the first woman to carrier qualify, Donna Lynn Spruill, was out in VR-50 at QB Point in the Philippines. She was not allowed to fly aboard ship. So she transitioned from her squadron to VR-40 on the East Coast. The East Coast Admiral would allow women to fly off the ship, or at least he had said he wouldn't. So she went there and she carrier qualified within a month of going back on the East Coast. So lots of times it was individuals that stood in the way. And Donna or Lynn laughingly said, and the ship she first landed on was the Independence.
Thank you, sir. Oh, did you have something else you want to say?
No, you go ahead.
Okay.
You're gonna
so-
have some lunch and we go.
Okay. Yeah. So I'm gonna skip ahead a little bit to, you mentioned Desert Shield, Desert Storm there, Kelly, and that was really a turning point in this March. So because during that operation, that set of operations, 30,000 women participated. It was a logistics war. There was tons of tankers and transport aircraft going over there. And by the time the war was over, it was obvious to the American public that women were pretty much already in combat. So the House immediately repealed the Combat Exclusion Law in 1991, but then things stalled in the Senate. So can we talk now a little bit about maybe a little bit about what happened to Desert Storm, if anybody wants to talk about that, and then what happened after the House bill passed.
Well, basically, the group that I went over with built the air refueling air bridge, which brought the B-52s clear across from Texas nonstop all the way into the theater, dropped the bombs, refueled on the way back, etc. In order to do that, when our organization went over, first of all, we weren't allowed to tell anybody. How about that? A lot of my staff spent most of their time every single day coordinating with foreign governments for overflight opportunities, but not being able to say why. So it was to look just like a regular air refueling mission or a cargo mission or whatever. So there was obviously a lot of below deck, if you will, things that were going on. That being said, it was a matter of bringing people through, and we used a bunch of different areas. The Azores was one of the areas we were in, and that was a forward positioning. So folks would come through, we would basically give them the briefings, get them set up within 2 days, get them ready to launch again, and continue to do the refueling missions and the forward movement into Saudi Arabia, into Turkey, into a lot of different areas across the board. It was a huge and massive operation to do that, like they say, was kind of all under wraps. And I know many of the women who are here today were in different parts of that theater. And the one thing that I can say from the missions that I flew in, although I was staff, I was also an active flyer during the war. And my biggest memories are, it was the first time that I had honestly ever seen what we'd only read about, which was where you have a stack. You have receivers, you have tankers, you have CAP, you have air controllers with the AWACS. It was amazing to see. The other part that was amazing was you were running dark. So for the most part, it was no lighting, or it was night vision goggles. And it was surreal on so many levels, so many levels. I would just say that every single person that was in that theater, they respected each other as crew members and part of a bigger team. It was never an issue. And on my comments earlier, what I want to say is my DO was a difficult person, my director of operations. I'm sure there were some others out there, but over the years, with the women that I have met and known, they worked for people who didn't have that kind of opposition. And in my particular case, and you may find yourself in the same case, just as Diana said, you pick your fights. And if you throw down the gauntlet, you need to make sure you're going to win. We were very fortunate. You'll notice that I am wearing a very colorful shirt. This very colorful shirt is a tribute to the WASP. It is from the WASP Museum. The WASP were key and critical when we went back to get our combat repeal. They were our voice on so many levels. When we had to go to the Hill, the Air Force in particular said, Air Force, you will not go to the Hill in uniform. The Navy went in uniform, the Army, you all went in uniform, I believe. And so we had that representation. I know some of you have met me and my comrades at the booth today, part of Women Military Aviators. That group was rock solid in getting the law changed and reaching out to the folks in Congress, such as we had Heather Wilson, who was an Air Force Academy grad, who was right by our side when we were making that fight. We had folks, Becky Constantino, who was part of Dokowitz. If you haven't met Dokowitz or don't know that name, get to know it. They are your friends. They can be your friends. A few years back, somebody tried to decide they were going to go away. Oh gosh, someone thought that. I wonder who that was.
My Desert Storm experience was as a C9 transport pilot. So here I was 15 years in, active in reserve in the Navy, and just pinned on commander. I was doing deployments to Sigonella and Rhoda for 2 weeks at a time. And the closest, and I had like one ribbon to my name, like pistol expert. That was it. I mean, I was a cold warrior. There was nothing going on when I was flying A4 Skyhawk. So here we had, a conflict, a regional conflict, Desert Shield, Desert Storm. So I flew C9 missions over there, carrying personnel and cargo throughout the Eastern Mediterranean and Southwest Asia. And I'm like, oh, finally got a couple ribbons, But actually, it was a serious logistics war, and women were a huge part of it because we flew transports and, as Kelly said, tankers, and we were instrumental in the mission of Desert Shield, Desert Storm. So one thing that happened was one of our C9s was going into Saudi Arabia, and there was a Scud attack, and they actually had to break it off and flee the airport in their C9. So I was like, well, even a C9 can have some danger. You're in the op area. So fortunately, we had successful C9 missions throughout the time I was working in that squadron, and the conflict ended after a month. The shooting war only lasted a month. Desert Storm. Anybody else?
So I transitioned from active duty, it was active duty 141s and C-21s, and then I went across the ramp at Andrews Air Force Base to fly C-141s in the reserve. The reason I did that was because of General Peak and how he was making things go backwards for women in the Air Force. The 141 was not a tactical airplane. The C-17 was going to replace the 141. And that was designated by General McPeak as a tactical airplane. So the plane that I had flown active duty, I couldn't fly the replacement aircraft for that. So I said, I don't want to be on active duty if this is the way the leadership is going, but I wanted to continue serving. So the very day I left active duty, I went into the reserve. Less than a year later, Desert Storm came up. And it was phenomenal because here Andrews was right outside Washington, D.C., and we were basically under the microscope of how is this build up toward the war going on. I mean, we had reporters all over the place, and Rosemary sent me to some interview with an NPR person about what were we doing. And there were over 35,000 women deployed for Desert Storm. That number is phenomenal. And they were all in support roles, so to speak. However, as was originally mentioned, we could get shot at, but we couldn't shoot back. And an interesting thing was, normally on 141, we would fly downrange and not lay over in the tents because there was no room for us in the tents. So we would have anywhere between a 16 and a 26-hour crew duty day. Go downrange, offload, unload, come back to Europe. Very long days. One time I did lay over, and it was in a compound that belonged to the Saudi Arabian military. They gave it to the US military for the use during Desert Storm. I was told when we had a layover that night that in this compound, again, a Saudi military compound turned over to the US for this war, that they had, it was a female radio operator, an enlisted person who was very well qualified and the only one on that base who was qualified to operate a particular type of radio. Well, it was like 120 degrees outside, and there was a pool on this compound, and our folks were allowed to use it and cool off when they were off duty. Well, it just so happened that there was a Saudi Arabian civilian looking through the fence and saw this woman in her one-piece bathing suit in the pool and created all kinds of problems. So from that, the US military leadership within that compound were told that they had to get rid of her, which they did. Put her on a flight and sent her away until 2 weeks later when they realized they couldn't do what they needed to do on that base. They needed her back, and they brought her back, but they never told the Saudis. So think about that. If we go to war in South Africa or any other country like that, are we going to turn away, you know, our African American soldiers and airmen and sailors because that government tells us they don't want them in the military or to fight or to be present? Never. It would never happen. So that was a clear eye opener for me. As you mentioned, the Scud missile attack. The night of January 15th was the night that Saddam Hussein was told, get out of Kuwait or we were coming in. That night I was flying down from Frankfurt with my 13 pallet positions in the 141 filled from top to bottom, front to back with empty metal caskets. It was in preparation of what we expected could happen. When that Scud missile hit the base, it was the barracks, and there were over 30 of our soldiers that were killed. Several of those were women, and I was the aircraft commander on the flight from Dahran to fly 26 of those KIAs back to Frankfurt, and from Frankfurt they went on to Dover. And it was very solemn. It was also solemn because we also had about 75 emergency leave people going back to the States, and they had to look at those caskets, each one of them with dignity draped in the American flag. It was very chilling. But what that proved to me, to see those women's names on those caskets, is women not only showed up and were present, they were part of the fight, even if they were in support positions. You couldn't protect us anymore. We needed to be able to protect ourselves and our comrades by being put in whatever position we were qualified to hold.
I don't know how you guys could stand sitting down all this time. Okay, so what did I do during Desert Storm? Well, I wore BDUs. I was at the Army Material Command in Washington, D.C., or Alexandria, D.C. So I had what I would call the catbird seat. I was in I'll say the war room, and there was a special group of 3 of us that knew Army Material Command. So if some tasker would come in, a supply request would come in that would cross over 2 or more areas of operation, then it landed on my desk and the desk of these other 2 officers. We were also invited to all the classified briefings. So I could see what CNN was showing us, and then I could hear the real intel briefing. And it was just fascinating, very fascinating. Little known fact, military police in the Army, a couple things they do is they handle prisoners of war. But does everybody remember the Hail Mary? Well, no, most people in here are Air Force. It was the Army's Hail Mary that went around. Anyhow, it was a great Army operation. And the first person that went across the battle line was Lieutenant Colonel Mary Myers, who was the battalion commander of the MP battalion. And the MP's jobs, they had many women in there, was to go set up a landing zone, secure that landing zone so that the infantry could come in. Now, and when that was briefed to our 4-star, it was like, yes. So, and building up to what we did on the Hill. So here we have that data point, and we had, as Terry said, we had all these women that were doing all these jobs. And it wasn't like World War II where you had the battle lines were drawn in nice, neat little pins. It was everywhere. And you weren't safe anywhere. And then in March, the day after the ceasefire, Major Marie Rossi was flying her Chinook helicopter after flying all day. It gets dark and she runs into an unlit microwave tower, thank you, and dies. I was the officer in charge of AMC that, and I was the duty officer when that call came in. Didn't tell us who it was. All they said was a woman. And it was like, oh my God. I was the 68th female to graduate from the Army's flight school. At that time, they only let 12 of us go in every year. So you can imagine, I knew most of the women that came in ahead of me. So it was like, it's not that if a guy had died, I'd have felt any worse, but, you know, I probably knew her. So when it came time to go to the Hill, we had, although I wasn't there, I had stories from the intel going on in Saudi, and it was hard to, well, it was easy to look these Congress people in the face and say, you weren't there, but my friends were. And so we'll set up the data for the charge on the Hill.
Rosemary was in command of VAQ 34. She had been in command about 3 weeks when Desert Storm started. Her second week in command, they had an uncommanded ejection from 2 pilots. Neither one of them that they ever proved caused the ejection. The airplane crashed north of Ojai, California, and started forest fire. So headlines in the LA Times were Navy airplane starts forest fire. That's not a very nice thing to have on your resume in the Navy, and particularly in California, where fires keep raging for a long time. So Rosemary's in the process of answering all these congressionals and stuff going on, and Saddam Hussein crossed the line and went into Kuwait to absolve his debts from previous war. And suddenly nobody cared about forest fire in California. And Rosemary's Squadron was VAQ 34. They provided adversary training for the battle groups. The Navy deployed 8 battle groups during Desert Storm. We had not deployed 8 battle groups since World War II. I was in charge of the weapons support directorate at Point Magoo, doing weapons testing. And we also were in charge of checklist, and we're also the liaison between the fleet and the shore commands for getting all the weapons out of the storage. So we had 9 ship loads of weapons stored away. We put 8 of them on carriers and deployed those carriers. 4 of the carriers stayed long enough to go in combat in Desert Storm. So Rosemary's Squadron was constantly flying East Coast, West Coast, out of Alaska, out of Hawaii, out of Puerto Rico, providing support because they had the missile systems on them, or at least the simulators for the missile systems that we expected the Iraqis to be shooting at us. They had French systems, they had some of our systems, and so those guys were constantly working. Rosemary did not go in theater. She did send a couple of her pilots in theater to train the air crews at various bases, and also provide support for the Marines that were not on the ships. So the backdrop of that was there were not only the 35,000 women that were deployed, but there were another 6,000 people like Terry and Lucy that were taking airplanes in and out constantly. So maybe as many as 41,000 women were involved. Rosemary was a student of history. She knew that war often brings change. And so when she got notification by Heather and people on Dakowitz, Rosemary had been an activist all along. She was well known in the Navy. Not always were they happy things that were said about her. And she cared. She wasn't the type that just blindly didn't care about those things, but she was also very persistent. And having, I guess the thing that really pissed her off more than anything else, when we did a deployment in 1979, we did a family day beforehand, Independence Day cruise out of San Diego. And Rosemary could not go aboard the ship in uniform, although she outranked me by a year. She could not go aboard the aircraft carrier in uniform without an escort, and that really made her mad. And that was kind of the third thing, along with not being allowed to go jets, not being able to CQ, and then not being able to walk aboard her own nation's ship in her own uniform. And so she was determined really to change things. And so she had spent the previous 12 years getting ready for this fight, networking. And she had Nancy and all sorts of folks in her Rolodex that she was able to call and talk to. She knew where people were. She called people in Army headquarters and in Air Force headquarters, and of course in the CNO's office, and they knew her name. So it was a lot of help when this began to break. The other thing that was kind of interesting was Beverly Byram from Chattanooga was rare for Tennessee, having a Democratic Congresswoman at the time. And Beverly, of course, was female. And Beverly was not a lot of help in this fight, but Rosemary could always mention, my Congresswoman, Beverly Byram, would be interested to know. And Beverly probably would have been interested, but she might have been on the wrong side of this fight. So, and Pat Schroeder took the lead, and that was, she got most of the bad publicity for changing the law on the House side. And then when it came to the Senate, Rosemary had been, when she did the transition in VA 174, John McCain was her CO. And McCain initially was relatively supportive of the women, but then he got the Eagle Forum descended upon him, led by Phyllis Schlafly, And they say, we're gonna get you defeated next year if you go and support the women in this Women in Combat thing. Sam Nunn from Georgia, Democrat, was very much against it. He was the head of the House Armed Services Committee, and nothing had gone through the House Armed Services Committee to the floor without his approval for the previous 8 years. So when the House passed it with very little opposition, when it came over to the Senate, both John McCain and Sam Nunn, sorry, senior moment. Sam Nunn opposed the thing. Well, Bill Roth, a Republican from Delaware, got together with his good friend Teddy Kennedy from Massachusetts. And so Kennedy's staff and Roth's office became sort of the nexus for the opposition. And they called Rosemary as at the time vice president of WMA and soon to be president of WMA. And they worked with her. In fact, she always felt a little uncomfortable with, and kept Chinpo involved in the process of knowing what was going on, because they would call her at night and say, Rosemary, what do you think about this? And but Senator Roth's support of that was critical. So invest in your Roth IRAs.
So Lucy, you were one of the people that got called by Rosemary, right? You were one of the people that Rosemary called, right?
Actually, Trish Beckman called me.
Oh,
She was a longtime leader of Women Military Aviators, and I can tell you, Women Military Aviators was absolutely instrumental in making all this happen. She coordinated, called up people she knew that could lend credence to the women's capabilities. And she called me up and said, Lucy, you really need to get up here. Put on your uniform, get up here. And I was an airline pilot flying 737s. I just finished a trip. I'm like, let me think about this. And then 5 seconds later, I'm like, I gotta go. And so next morning I was on a flight to DC, went in my summer whites and reported to the capital area and met up with these folks that Tommy's describing, who were coordinating an impressive coalition of women's groups, military members, and people that could get things done in Washington. Me not wanting to normally talk to the press, I was a reservist, and I got interviewed by Bart Gellman and another individual. Let's see. Oh, Jim Adams from Reuters. And luckily I wrote all this down. Ladies, if you do something like this, please write your notes down. Because I recaptured the whole thing by looking at my notes. But yeah, it was a very consequential 24 hours of my life when Trish called me to come up there. And my job was to go around to Senate offices and tell the staffers, I have carrier qualified. I'm air combat maneuvering qualified. I have drop practice bombs. I fly a tactical jet. And I didn't at that time, I was flying transports, but I said, I've done all these things, and women can do these jobs in the United States Navy. So it was just a matter of lending credibility to the capabilities of women military aviators. And WIMA was the group that made it all happen, thanks to Trish and Rosemary, and you were the president, right? Yeah, Kelly was the president, thank you.
Yeah, Kelly, tell us about your fax machine burning up there.
I'm sorry.
About your fax machine
Oh,
burning.
God.
So, yeah.
Yeah, I'm sorry, do y'all know what a fax machine is?
That's the point, yeah. It's what we used to, it's what was the precursor to email.
That's right. Yeah, because think about this seriously, you know, right now we text each other all day long, and in a minute we can get the news out. I had been actually reassigned in the middle of my deployment. My base had shut down, and I had been sent to, oh my God, the worst, right? Hawaii. Okay. But the problem with Hawaii was my dear friends who lived on the mainland would call me at 2 o'clock in the morning, Rosemary and Trish, and the folks saying, here's the plan, here's what we have to do, and you have to come back to DC and we have to do this plan, and we'd all sit down in their living room and start this planning action. That being said, I bought a fax machine, and we put out the word to say, get a hold of any group that you think would be supportive of basically women. So it was, you know, the Women's Teachers Organization, the Professional Women's Group, it was everybody. So we went out there and said, here's the situation. And a couple of the things that we said were, okay, we went to Desert Storm. Everybody ask yourself, did you know a woman who served? Sister, daughter, neighbor, friend. So suddenly it was like, it wasn't some, oh, no, they don't do this. Everyone knew. And then Phyllis Schlafly, God love her. We did a lot of Rosemary did one-on-ones with her. I did one-on-ones with her, and it was unpleasant because I got so tired of hearing, you have to be a mother, you have to stay in the kitchen, you can't do this, you can't. And it annoyed me. But the other part was, it was always, they're going to take you POW and they're going to rape you. And I said, okay, so that's happened, let's get on with it. And we're still here to talk about it. And you're going to die. Yes. Marie Rossi died. And she was one of us. And you don't disrespect her by saying, you can't ever do this again. You know? So the bottom line of all of that is, yes, the fax machine played a big role in this. Every single person out there played a big role in it. Moms, dads, sisters, brothers, cousins, neighbors. And when the time came to stand up and write the congressman, and back then that had some impact, or go and visit your congressman, it happened. I was in Hawaii. A gentleman who is now my husband and has been for the last many years, he went to the Hill when they went to the Hill with the WASP. The WASP were our backs and our voices as well. For those of you who are in the military, the one thing I will tell you right now, active duty, is you need to make sure that you give your sister service members, when you're trying to get a change, you need to make sure you got their back. Diana, if there was an Army issue, she would come and say, here's the Army issue. Navy, Air Force, Marines, one of us would bring the issue to Dokowitz and represent it. In the audience, we always had Army women in uniform if it was an Army issue, Navy women in uniform if it was a Navy issue, because you want them to visually see you exist, you're there, this means something to you. But we never allow our members to go in the line of fire. So have your sisters back. Have it. Oh, yes, and I'm sorry, and Rhonda Hornum, who was a flight surgeon, is the one who was taking POW. And
Along with a private, truck driver, along with Army private truck driver. Okay, so you're probably all sitting out there thinking, I'd like to get involved. I want you to think about this. Are you willing to give up your career for the people who you don't know, you'll never meet, and they're coming up behind you? So in July 91, Trish Beckman calls, says, Diana, I need you on the Hill. Tomorrow. And I said, Trish, I'm leaving for Missouri tomorrow to visit my mother, whom I haven't seen in 2 years. She said, tell your mother it might be another 2 years, you're on the Hill. I love Trish. Trish should be here. Trish was so instrumental in doing all this, like Lucy said. She was the person who made sure we went on leave. We were in our uniform. We had the right talking points. She put all the logistics together. Rosemary did a great job coordinating all this other stuff. So I had some thinking to do. I worked for a 4-star general. I felt disloyal because the Army's, or any service, you're not supposed to go on the Hill in uniform. That's all there is to it. Poor taste, I was told. I called my mentor up and I was whining. I know it's hard to believe. And I said, I feel disloyal. You know, I work for this 4-star general and I feel disloyal to him. And she just, and thank God it was on the telephone. She said, Diana, and I thought she was my mother, Diana, why do you think a 4-star general can't handle a major going to the Hill? If he can't handle that, what good is he? And besides, where do your loyalties lie? With that 4-star general, or to those women coming up behind you that you will never meet? They will never know your name, but you know you have helped bust through that door. Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. So I hung up. And now the practical side of it, ladies and gentlemen, we knew in our hearts of hearts, when we put on our uniform and we went to the Hill, that we were putting our careers in jeopardy. I was a major. I had just put on my clover leaves. And I wasn't ready to give them up, but okay, so what did I do? I got out my calculator. I said, if I retire as a major, this is how much I'll get. If I retire as a lieutenant colonel, this is how much I'll get. There was a little difference. I thought, well, I could sell pencils on the street. The other reason I went was, number one, Trish Beckman told me something that changed the way I think for the rest of my life. We both went through a test pilot program. She went through the Navy, I went through the Army. Then the difference is the Navy flies 50, 60 some aircraft. The Army, we go through, we study ground school for a little while, and then we have 3 or 4 weeks in an aircraft. But it's either the UH-1 for 3 or 4 weeks, then we go back to the Black Hawk, then the OH-58. We don't fly a whole bunch of different aircraft at the same time or at the test pilot course. And for the Army, we have a checklist book about this thick. And unlike the speaker at lunch, Pam Malloy, the Army doesn't just memorize what's in bold, we memorize everything. I said, Trish, how do you memorize everything for 50 some aircraft? Write this down. She said, Diana, we only memorize what will kill us. Everything else we can look up. So after I hung up the phone, I got out my calculator and I sat there and thought, what will kill me in the future if I don't go? So off to the Hill we went. I was one of 2 Army women that went, and the way they orchestrated it, it was brilliant. It was by color. They wanted somebody green, somebody white and Navy, and somebody blue. So poor Terry was like in every briefing because she was one of the only Air Force people there. And we went around and we educated. We had to make double doggone sure we only educated. We didn't get political. So, and it was a great thing that the women military aiders did. And one thing that, as I went through that, and I honestly believe that all those people that are on Capitol Hill, they truly want to do the right thing. What their interpretation of the right thing is, isn't necessarily what ours is. But Colonel Nancy Burt, who's right up here, she was the Army's 16th female to go through flight school, the 2nd test pilot. She once told me, democracy requires vigilance. We have to make sure we continue to beat down those doors. And what Kelly Hamilton always said is, just because you've won something so far doesn't mean it's going to stay like that.
Yes, Tommy, I just wanted to warn you, we only have about 4 minutes left. So.
Well, from the strategy, one of the things, the reason they were in Navy was in flights. We had a policy in the Navy that you couldn't go to the Hill in blues unless you're on official duty. So that's one of the reasons that Rosemary decided we're going to go and everybody take leave. We're going to be in Liberty uniforms. And because it was a summertime, it was comfortable uniform. And also they wanted to be in uniform so the women would have the wings on their chest and their ribbons below them. So people would know we've been doing this for 20 years. We're already qualified. We don't need a study for this. We are the study.
Yeah, go ahead, Terry.
Okay, very briefly, because I know we're cutting it short here, time's up, but yeah, they needed an Air Force uniform on the Hill, and I was in the reserve, and I was flying for a 141 unit where the wing ops officer took 6 months to decide whether I could join the unit or not because he didn't want any women pilots. So he was not in favor of women pilots, period. So I went to my squadron officer when I got a call from Rosemary and also from Trish to go to the Hill in uniform. He was in favor of women pilots, women in general. And I said, Bill, this is the plan. We're going to the Hill and we're going in uniform. Is there anything you have to say about that? And he said, if I told you not to go, would you go anyway? And I said, yep. And he said, well, then just make sure you don't get in jail. And the other thing was, we were briefed, and this went through all of the levels of WMA leadership, DACWITS, Carolyn Beecraft, and all the different coordinated entities to make this happen. The time was right. The time was right. And we had to show up in numbers. We did show up in numbers in Desert Storm. We had to show up in numbers from that point on to push it forward, be in uniform, take a risk, be coordinated, back each other up. And that's what this was all about. It wouldn't have happened for all you youngsters out there, maybe for another 15, 20 years, or maybe the next war, who knows? But it was an opportunity, and there was leadership at many levels that got all of us involved to make what you have in opportunities today.
One last thing, Rosemary did keep her boss in the loop. Steve Briggs was the Latwing Pack commander at the time, and he said basically the same thing that Terry heard was, you're gonna go in, right? And he said, don't end up in jail. And Rosemary was in command at the time. She was used to giving commands. I took a few of them, and but Peggy Carnahan was one of the people, not in her chain of command, that she was saying, don't do this, Peggy. Trish Beckman was the same way. So somebody has to be in charge to do those things. And Rosemary was willing to take that hit because she was, by the way, finishing up her command. She'd been in command for 2 years and she had to give it up in about a month anyway. So they were going to court-martial her, which she actually expected to be court-martialed. And a 3-star and a 4-star both tried to do that, but the Chief of Naval Operations said, leave them alone. They've got a good point. They're American citizens who want to do their job. So Admiral Kelso should always be remembered for standing up and calling off the 4-star Pac Fleet commander who wanted to kill Roosevelt.
Thank you. So unfortunately, we're out of time. The law did get repealed in 1991. The Senate did repeal it. Unfortunately, it took 2 more years before the services did finally start training women in combat roles. So I'd also like to point out that none of the women on this panel today and other WMA members of that time, none of them ever actually got to fly a combat aircraft because they were too far along in their careers by the time the law got repealed. So, but they fought so that all of you would have that opportunity. So let's give it up.
I'll just say, this year marks the Army's 50th anniversary, and I'm hosting an Army happy hour, and anybody wants to be an honorary Army member for an hour, meet at the bar to the right of the lobby, you know, where you checked in, drinks are on me.